Hello and welcome back. Today on the Crime Reel, we shall be looking at the life story and horrifying crimes of Stephen Roy Harper. Stephen Roy Harper was born on the 18th of April 1953. He was the first child of Jesse and Eva Lou Harper, who went on to have two more sons, Michael and James, and a daughter by the name of Carol. Stephen grew up in Omaha, Nebraska, and enjoyed a happy childhood with his siblings for the first 9 years of his life. In 1962, this all changed. While playing with one of his brothers, they agreed to meet up with some of their friends at a nearby rubbish dump. One of these friends brought about some petrol with him, and the boys were playing around, starting small fires at the dump. Before long, they became more boisterous in their play, and Stephen accidentally caught fire. He rolled onto the ground to try to put out the flames, but they took hold very quickly. The left side of his body became engulfed in fire, and by the time help arrived and the flames were extinguished, 9-year-old Stephen had gone into shock. He suffered severe burns, and it was unclear whether or not he would survive his injuries. After months in hospital and numerous operations, Stephen was eventually discharged, but the scars from the fire, both physical and mental, were very deep. His previously confident nature all but disappeared, and he became increasingly introverted. He withdrew from human contact, preferring to spend his time with animals. He was an intelligent boy and threw himself into his studies as his way of dealing with the traumatic event that had happened to him. He excelled in his schooling, taking a particular interest in history, biology, and science. He hoped to become a veterinarian one day. However, as he progressed through middle and high school, his social isolation became an increasingly bigger problem for him. He was extremely self-conscious because of his scars, and whilst a large part of him wanted to take part in all of the parties, dating, and social events normally associated with high school, his extreme lack of confidence and fear of rejection over his injuries led him to retreat further into himself. Again, he turned to his studies to compensate for his non-existent social life. He graduated at the top of his class and was eventually accepted into a well-respected university to further study Latin and biology. He continued to be isolated and withdrawn until 1973, at the age of 20, when out of the blue a girl by the name of Sandy made contact with him. Sandy had attended the same high school as Stephen, and he had always had a crush on her, but was too scared to act upon it. Sandy was an extremely pretty, blonde cheerleader who received attention from many of the boys in school, so Stephen always felt that she was out of his league. Sandy had married young, and when this marriage broke down, she walked into Stephen's life, and they soon began dating. Stephen had never had a girlfriend before, and he soon fell madly in love. Sandy had never been particularly studious, and after a while cracks began to appear in their relationship. Sandy wanted to settle down, get married and have children, while Stephen was keen to finish his veterinarian qualifications first. Stephen promised Sandy that he would marry her in 1975 once he had graduated, which seemed to heal the rift for a while. However, with their lives seemingly on very different paths, the cracks once again appeared and they split up. Stephen could not face going back to his isolated life, and 2 months later contacted Sandy, believing that they could rekindle their relationship and this time make it work. However, he was shocked to find that Sandy had already moved on. She was dating a new man by the name of Dwayne Johnson, and informed Stephen that she planned to marry Dwayne. Stephen was devastated. His one true love and the only person with whom he had ever felt truly happy had rejected him and was marrying someone else. Stephen pleaded with Sandy to end things with Dwayne and take him back, but Sandy's mind was made up, and on January the 17th, 1975, Sandy and Dwayne married in Omaha, Nebraska. Stephen continued with his studies and soon graduated with a degree in biology. However, he couldn't get over losing Sandy and slowly turned to drink and drugs to try to ease his despair. By June of 1975, he had become extremely depressed, and at some point his sadness at losing his relationship with Sandy turned into anger at what he saw was her betrayal when she married another man. On June 20th, 1975, Stephen got into an extremely heated argument with his father. He threatened to kill his father, then threatened to kill himself before driving off with a shotgun. In the early hours of 21st of June, Stephen drove to the street where Sandy and Dwayne now lived. This was opposite the house where Sandy had grown up and her mother still lived there. He saw 6 people outside the house: Sandy, Dwayne, Sandy's brother Dan and his girlfriend, and Sandy's sister Sally and her boyfriend Bruce. Fueled by rage, Stephen shot at Dwayne but missed. With Dwayne running for cover, Stephen pointed his gun at Sandy, shouting to see where Dwayne had gone. Sandy's brother Dan stepped in to protect his sister, and Stephen shot him in the shoulder. With all the noise, Sandy's mum came out of her house opposite to see what was going on, and Stephen turned and shot her in the face. Stephen then shot Dan a second time before speeding off in his truck, which he then abandoned and disappeared. Miraculously, both Dan and Sandy's mother survived the attack. Stephen's truck was later found with the rifle still inside and a 12-inch hunting knife under the seat, but there was no sign of Stephen. He managed to stay hidden for almost a year by travelling to Oklahoma, where he stayed with his uncle. During his time in Oklahoma, he visited a psychiatrist who diagnosed him with schizophrenia. Less than a year after the shooting, Stephen was stopped when riding his motorcycle for a small traffic violation. The police officer soon found that there was a warrant out for Stephen's arrest, and he was immediately detained. He was charged with attempted murder, to which he pleaded no contest and wrote a letter to the judge detailing his deep remorse for the incident. He was sent to jail in Nebraska, where he was sentenced to 1 to 5 years for his crimes. He became a model prisoner, never getting into trouble, and spent most of his time alone reading. By July 1977, he was allowed out of jail on work release and was paroled by November of that year. However, his appearance during his time in prison was deceptive. With more time to dwell on events, he became increasingly obsessed with Sandy and became ever more bitter, vowing revenge on the people that had caused him so much pain. By November 1977, he had returned to the Omaha area to live with his parents and, at least on the surface, started to turn his life around. He secured a position as a research assistant at the Epley Research Institute in Omaha in March 1978. This new, calmer life would not last long. Stephen's behaviour became increasingly strange during 1978. He started to study Satanism and became obsessed with demons. He once again started to drink heavily and use drugs. Sandy and Dwayne received phone calls at all hours of the day and night, but no one would be there when they answered. Stephen also mailed them disturbing images which he had drawn, which showed Sandy in distorted form as a witch or evil spirit. His obsession and need for revenge had spiralled out of control. Contrastingly, by September 1978, Sandy and Dwayne had been moving on with their lives. They had been married for 3.5 years and had 2 children, a daughter called Sherry, who was 2, and a 1-year-old son called Michael. They lived in a small 3-bedroom home on Fontanelle Boulevard in Omaha. They had bought the house less than a year earlier, and even though it was small, it was in a nice, quiet neighbourhood, and they had settled into their new home well. Dwayne worked hard and drove a truck for a local company delivering industrial gases and equipment. Sandy's sister, Sally, was now married to Bruce, and they had an 11-month-old son by the name of Chad. They lived in a house in Sharon Drive, which was a few miles away from Sandy and Dwayne. Sally worked at a large insurance company, Mutual of Omaha, and was the main breadwinner in the family, whilst Bruce earned a regular wage by repairing television sets. This setup was perhaps more unconventional in the 1970s than it would be today, but by all accounts they were a very happy family. The sisters, Sally and Sandy, were very close and visited or spoke to each other regularly. On Sunday, 10th of September 1978, Sandy and Dwayne had a slow start to their day. They had been playing cards the previous evening and ended up having a late night. While the family ate their breakfast, Dwayne declared that the milk they had tasted funny. Sandy checked it and there seemed to be nothing at all wrong with it, but they threw it away anyway just to be safe. Dwayne had decided to paint the outside of their home that day while Sally was planning to go shopping to Kmart. Dwayne got on with the painting, turning the outside of their house from blue to yellow, and was busy up a ladder when Sandy's father Harold and stepmother Elaine dropped in for a visit. As they left, Elaine noticed that Dwayne seemed to be having trouble pronouncing his words, almost talking in slow motion, but Dwayne insisted he was fine. Around midday, Sandy arrived back from shopping far earlier than expected. She told Dwayne that she had to leave the store and come home straight away as 2-year-old Cherie had started vomiting. Soon after, Dwayne started being violently sick and aching all over. Assuming that they had the flu, they both went to bed while Sandy took care of them as well as she could. That same morning, Sally and Bruce had been busy shampooing their carpets and then shopping for more items for their newly acquired home. On the way home from the shops, they decided to stop by and visit Sandy and Dwayne to show them some new lamps which they had purchased. When they arrived at Sandy and Dwayne's house, Sandy informed them that Dwayne and Cherie had the flu, so Sally and Bruce only stayed for a few minutes before making their way across town to attend a birthday party for Bruce's young niece. Even though there was plenty of cake and ice cream at the party, Sally and Bruce decided to stop and buy tacos on the way home. Like Dwayne with the milk earlier that day, Sally felt that the tacos tasted funny, and even though Bruce said that he thought they were okay, they decided to throw them away before finishing them. Shortly after returning home, their 11-month-old baby Chad was violently sick. He had been unusually lethargic all afternoon, which they originally put down to tiredness. But now Sally and Bruce were thinking that he also had the flu. Sally's body started to ache all over, and she decided on an early night. Before long, she was awoken by the sound of Bruce being violently sick and struggling for breath. Sally tried to get up to help him, but found that she could barely move. They called a doctor who said that it sounded as though they had food poisoning. They assumed that this was caused by the funny tasting tacos, which they had also given to Chad, and they decided just to wait it out. They continued to vomit throughout the night, with the pain becoming increasingly worse. The following morning, Bruce felt slightly better and managed to drag himself to work. Sally stayed in bed, only moving to take care of Chad's needs. Neither of them could manage more than sips of water. Over at Sandy's house, Dwayne was in so much pain he was unable to go to work. 2-year-old Cherie was also in a great deal of pain, and neither one of them could keep down any food. Sandy spent the entire day caring for the two of them, and thought herself lucky not to develop any of these flu-like symptoms. The next morning, Tuesday, September the 12th, baby Chad still didn't seem any better, So Bruce and Sally decided that Bruce would take him to the hospital, as Sally still felt so ill that she could barely move. When Chad arrived at the Emmanuel Medical Centre, he was assessed and admitted. It was assumed that he had gastroenteritis, but until they were sure, he was placed in a room by himself. At that point, his colour and vitals seemed pretty normal, and they were concentrating on giving him plenty of fluids. Meanwhile, Sally had started to feel slightly better, but was still unable to eat. Wednesday 13th brought more symptoms for Dwayne. He had developed nosebleeds, blood clots in his eyes, and was bleeding from his gums. He could barely open his eyes as any light caused pain to shoot through his eyeballs. He was in excessive pain all over his body. That same morning, over at Emmanuel Medical Centre, baby Chad's condition had also deteriorated. His skin looked bruised, almost purple, and he was incredibly lethargic. They were still unable to figure out what was wrong and decided to move Chad from the medical centre to the children's hospital. Sally and Bruce were called and told to go to the hospital immediately. Upon arriving at the children's hospital, Chad's condition had deteriorated further. He was suffering from seizures and his skin was turning yellow, a common sign of liver problems. Various additional tests were ordered, all of which came back at dangerous levels. He began bleeding internally and his heart rate was starting to fluctuate. Sally and Bruce called Sandy and Dwayne to tell them what was happening with Chad. Dwayne and young Cherie were still very ill at this point, but believed it to be completely different to what was going on with Chad. Dwayne continued to get worse, and after more increasingly severe nosebleeds, he went to the emergency room at Emmanuel Medical Centre, where Chad had first been admitted. He was treated for the nosebleed and discharged. Still no connection between the two cases was made. The following day, Thursday, 14th of September 1978, heartbreakingly, baby Chad lost his battle with this mystery illness. He died at 4:30 a.m. It was 3 days before what would have been his first birthday. Sally called her sister Sandy to tell her the devastating news. Not only was Sandy distraught at the loss of her nephew, but she was also starting to panic that her husband and daughter had the same illness too. Sandy decided to take Dwayne and Cherie to get them assessed, but by the time they arrived at the hospital, Dwayne was unresponsive and bleeding severely. He had slipped into a coma and he was bleeding from his nose, eyes, ears, mouth and pores all over his body. His heartbeat was erratic and he began suffering from seizures. His internal organs were bleeding and there was nothing that could be done to help him. Less than a day later, at 10:25 a.m. on Friday, September the 15th, Dwayne died in agonising pain. 2-year-old Cherie's condition was also deteriorating. She too was bleeding from every orifice. Her liver was swollen and damaged, and she was not expected to survive. Unlike Dwayne, she was stable enough for a blood transfusion, which against the odds managed to save her life. She slowly began to recover, despite sustaining extensive liver damage. Sally and Bruce, who were still extremely ill, slowly began to respond to treatment and show signs of recovery. A nurse at the hospital finally made the connection between the symptoms experienced by Chad, Sally and Bruce and with those experienced by Dwayne and Cherie, and it soon came to light that all of the patients were related. Autopsies were conducted on Chad and Dwayne, which revealed extensive internal bleeding, but the most puzzling detail was that both of their livers were damaged to an extent that had never been seen before. However, despite extensive tests, the doctors could find no evidence of toxins in either Chad or Dwayne's bodies. The hospital did not know what to do. They had never seen a case like this before. They simply had no idea what was causing the illness, if it was contagious or how it was contracted. An emergency meeting was called, and the Centre for Disease Control was called in from Atlanta. Extensive tests were completed at both the sisters' houses. Was it chemicals in the paint that Dwayne had been using? Was it something in the Mexican food? The carpet cleaner that Sally and Bruce had used? The tap water. The strange tasting milk. Test upon test was completed, but everything came back negative. It was eventually discovered that both of the families had been together at Sandy and Dwayne's house a couple of days before the sickness started. This became the focus of the investigation, and yet still no toxins were found. Eventually they found a cause. Everyone who had drunk lemonade at the family gathering had become sick. Those who hadn't drunk it were fine. It was a very hot day when the family had been together, and Dwayne had quickly drunk 2 glasses of the lemonade to quench his thirst. Both Chad and Cherie had been given small amounts in their drinking cups. Also, Sally and Bruce had drunk 1 glass each. The symptoms and their severity depended on the amount ingested and the size of the person. Investigators were now faced with a problem. Any remaining lemonade had been disposed of and the pitcher washed. Tests on the lemonade mix did not show any toxins. Even though investigators were convinced that they had found the source of the problem, they still had no idea what the toxin was. Dr. Renate Kimbrough from the Centre for Disease Control uncovered similarities between the samples of Chad and Dwayne's livers and one from a case where a German woman had been poisoned years earlier. A chemical agent known as dimethylnitrosamine, but more commonly known as DMN, was used to poison her. DMN is a highly toxic, cancer-causing chemical which only affects the liver. It is water-soluble and excreted from the body within hours of being consumed, and as such leaves no trace. The investigation started to concentrate on any connection between the family and anyone who could have access to DMN. The chemical's most common use was to promote cancer in animals to aid in research against the disease. Suspicion soon fell upon Stephen Roy Harper. Not only did he have a history of violence towards the family, but he had access to the chemical through his work at the Epley Research Institute. As investigators looked into Stephen further, it was discovered that a month before the poisonings, he had taken his cat and dog to the local vets. Both had been treated for extensive bleeding issues, and both had died. There was still a major problem though. All evidence was circumstantial and would not be enough to prosecute Stephen. Eventually, the evidence that was needed to move the case forward was provided by Ronald Schenck at the University of California. From his extensive work, he knew how DMN affects the DNA, which mutates and starts to form into cancer. This leaves a type of footprint on the DNA, which can identify the previous presence of DMN. Dr. Kimbrough sent 8 liver samples to Ronald for a blind test. 7 of these samples were from unrelated livers, whilst the 8th was taken from the remains of Dwayne's liver. Once tested, the only sample which came back positive to previous DMN exposure belonged to Dwayne. With this new discovery in hand, a search warrant was issued for Stephen's home. In the garage there was evidence of animal experiments, as well as empty bottles of DMN stolen from his workplace. It was also discovered that a notice board at his workplace had a newspaper article which detailed how the German woman had been poisoned with DMN by her chemist husband. Stephen was arrested in Texas on the 13th of October 1978. He eventually confessed to the murders, telling police that he had broken into the house 2 days before the family gathering and emptied the contents of a bottle of DMN into a pitcher of lemonade in the fridge. He intended to kill only Sandy and Dwayne, believing that if he couldn't have Sandy, then no one could. He told detectives that he had thought that the dose he had given would result in Sandy and Dwayne developing cancer years later, and as such believed that no one would suspect any foul play. Not only did he dramatically misjudge the dose of DMN, there was also a flaw in his means of poisoning. Sandy never drank lemonade. He was flown back to Nebraska to stand trial for 2 counts of murder, and 3 counts of poisoning with intent to kill. The trial started in 1979, and despite his earlier confession, he pleaded not guilty to all charges. However, on the 5th of October 1979, Stephen was found guilty of the first-degree murder of Dwayne, the second-degree murder of Chad, and the attempted murder of Bruce, Sally and Cherie. On November 7th, 1979, Stephen was sentenced to death by electric chair. The execution date was set for the 15th of February 1980. Stephen showed no emotion during the sentencing. The execution date came and went as the date was constantly pushed back to allow for appeals. During his time in prison, Stephen became increasingly isolated and paranoid, and as appeals dragged on, he began to lose his sanity, suffering hallucinations, nightmares, and living in scenarios that were far away from the truth. He was prescribed antipsychotic medication, but this did little to help. He spent 11 years on death row, but on the night of December the 6th, 1990, he decided he could take no more. After returning to his cell after dinner, he wrote a farewell note to his parents, gathered a stash of pills that he had been collecting for months, swallowed them all, and went to sleep. He suffered a fatal heart attack and never woke up. Unfortunately, Stephen's legacy continued long after his death. Bruce recovered from the physical effects of the poisoning, but was so distraught over the loss of his son and consumed with fear of developing cancer, he lost his job, marriage, and home. He became an alcoholic and started to use drugs and died homeless in 1995 at the age of 37. Sally remarried but never had any more children due to her overwhelming fear that she would die and leave them alone. She died in 2014 at the age of 57 as a result of liver complications. Cherie suffered permanent liver problems as a result of the poisoning and never fully recovered. She also died in 2014 after battling liver problems her entire life. She was just 38 years old. Stephen Roy Harper was convicted of 2 murders, for which he ultimately paid with his life, albeit at his own hand. 5 years after his death, his actions claimed a 3rd victim, and a further 20 years later he was once again responsible, this time for the premature deaths of 2 more people. That concludes the Stephen Roy Harper story. Spare a thought for the victims involved in this one. Thank you so much for listening to The Crime Reel. I'll be interested for your comments this week. Goodbye. Psst. There isn't a psst this week. Oh, actually, yeah, there is. That was it. Goodbye.